it was hugely relieving to recognise some common themes from some of the earlier presentations, as some of the issues were brought up from Joe's last presentation as well. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is, as it says there, reactivation surveys and why they matter. I'm coming at this from the point of the people who are asking for the surveys, and principally I'm talking about insurers. I'm not going to delve into the technical conduct of the surveys. I'm not going to get into the weeds of specific templates and scopes of work and things like that. But really, this is just aiming to give a bit more of a sort of higher level context as to who asks for these surveys, why they're asking for them, and why they matter, and the sorts of rough sort of subject matter areas within the scope of a survey to that concern, you know, financiers and underwriters. Oh, down, you see.
Mm. Is it not playing ball?
No, right. Oh, down. Right. So first of all, a little bit of a plug. Who are we to talk about it? As a company, we were founded in 1962 in Houston, Texas. Moved to our head office to London in the mid-70s. Been based there ever since. Bought by Bureau Veritas in 2014. And we're a company who are focused on service provision, technical service provision to offshore oil and gas insurers primarily, but also P&I clubs, underwriters, financiers, and banks. As I say, with a primary focus on the energy insurance market. We're globally roughly a 50-50 split between offshore pre-risk survey activity and the other 50% being offshore loss adjusting, which gives us a sort of unique ability to learn from both halves of the business to improve our service offering and you know, give us plenty of presentation material for events such as this. And tomorrow I'll be talking about offshore drilling rig casualties. Globally, the big grey blobs are where our sort of regional hubs are. We're part of the Bureau Veritas network, so we do have a worldwide presence, as all the little dots sort of aim to show here. But fundamentally, that's the Matthews Daniel laydown across the world, and I'm responsible for this bit down here with our 6 entities across Asia. So let's get into the meat of it now. What is reactivation? Well, if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, it's there. Sounds pretty straightforward. Fairly simple definition. So what I'll do over the course of this presentation is just delve a little bit into the market context. I think, you know, many presentations that all of us will have seen in recent years will have very similar slides and graphs. Try and identify who the stakeholders in the process are, who's looking for the assurance for a reactivation survey and why, and then the reactivation process in the context of the sorts of things they're looking for, but as I say, without really going into any specific template or any specific scope of work. And we can pick up at any point in the questions at the end. So, the market context. I mean, no great surprise to anyone in this room here. If you look, you know, end of 2014, beginning of 2015, oil price takes a huge nosedive off a cliff, and the offshore rig count steadily follows it down. As we've also heard, there's a growing sort of sense of optimism returning to the market, and then perhaps there's some sunny uplands ahead. But one particular forecast here from Douglas Westwood does show perhaps a look ahead with, you know, a fairly sort of steady expenditure sort of landscape. But what's interesting is that the offshore portion, under their predictions, is being squeezed by the onshore. So what am I trying to sort of say with this? It's vessels coming in and out of layup, hot and cold stack, whether it be OSVs, whether it be rigs. It's a feature of our industry that's here to stay for the foreseeable future. It's not going away anytime soon. And as if to re-emphasize, here's a chart looking specifically at the offshore support vessel fleets, and you can see sort of fleet volume growing as utilization's going down. simply because in the heydays of the high oil price, that's when orders were placed for OSVs and, of course, semi-subs, modules, and such like as well. So we've got a number of unusual factors that the industry hasn't seen before, which I'll touch on shortly. A little bit of fairly basic economics there. Supplies up, particularly from onshore. Demand for offshore assets is down. We've got idle assets. It's a simple statement of fact. One of the sort of features of this particular downturn now, though, is a greater emphasis on finance, particularly capital finance for a lot of assets. Rig values and modern generation OSV values are very sensitive to time being laid up and idle, and a number of values come into play here for vessel owners, for financiers, for insurers, and indeed for shipyards. And it's what's listed there. What is the vessel worth? And the longer it's laid up, what happens to that value? And who's judging that value, and who owns the risk on that value? Another sort of challenge that we face in the current market context is drill ships being laid up probably for the first time, particularly 6th and 7th generation, high spec DP twin derrick drill ships. It's a challenge that the offshore industry has not faced before. It didn't face it in the previous downturn in the 80s, and these things are having to really properly laid up. So how do you turn them back on? Because for some of them, they've never even done a day's work in their life. So how do you know what you're turning back onto what standard? All questions to consider. So we all know that it's been a pretty bleak few years, but hopefully, as I say, the sunny uplands are ahead of us. So in terms of reactivation, who's got skin in the game here? Well, as I've already said, insurers and banks, and if I take those sort of the other way around, banks in terms of the capital finance, whether it be the actual capital to build the asset in the first place, or whether it's finance that they've pumped into an organisation to keep it afloat during the course of the downturn. And if you look here in Singapore, for example, at Swiber and what happened with Swiber, going under for 24 hours till the government enforced judicial management on them because of the debt that was owed to DBS, one of the main banks here in Singapore. Insurers are interested in reactivation and the scope of reactivation because of insurance premiums. Insurance, in very, very simple terms, is a contractual obligation to pay claims. And it's the premiums of the many that pay the claims of the few. Therefore, to make that business model work, they need to be sure and be assured that assets that they are providing insurance coverage for are not going to generate too many claims, i.e. they're operating at a loss. And as a general rule of thumb, when a mobile offshore drilling unit goes into a period of layup, its insurance premium is reduced by at least half. But we are also at the moment in a soft insurance market, which means there is ample capacity and therefore insurance premiums are down. So when that asset comes back out of layup, it's not an automatic 50% rebound back up again. It could be a figure less than that, making the insurer's position from a commercial sense a lot more fraught. Owners and operators, clearly major stakeholders in the process, and it's something that Joe touched upon in the previous presentation. Qualified personnel who know the rig, and for rig, read OSV as well. Do they know the asset that is being reactivated? Do they know how to operate it? Do they know how to get it to the field safely, etc., etc., etc.? Flag state and regulators have clearly got an interest in terms of the areas of the maritime asset that they're responsible for. A couple listed here, as have class and classification societies. And during the course of the layup, class will have had a hand in that, and class will have an interest and a hand in the reactivation as well from their perspective. Quite often for reactivating assets as well, there'll be specialist inspection companies that will look at specifics such as the drilling package, the mud pumps, the DP systems, so on and so forth. And finally, somewhere at the end of that list will come surveyors who bring the independent assurance to many of the folks listed above there. So who are those folks? Well, as I've already sort of talked about, a lot of it, it's the money. Insurers will look to include some form of warranty on the insurance policy that will mandate the requirement for reactivation surveys. And they will specify quite often within that warranty who they will be satisfied with the assured, i.e. the vessel operator or rig operator, picking to conduct those surveys. And that's the technical experts here. Banks, as I've already said, have got a financial interest in the asset value, it not breaking down, it not sinking, it not doing something that it's not meant to do. And again, they may look for that assurance as well to make sure that the mortgaged asset or the financed asset is going to be first and foremost safe, but secondly operated or reactivated in a way that's not going to detrimentally affect its value. But it's also about QHSE and reputation. And again, some of the previous presentations have quite adequately drawn this out. What we tend to find as we do this work globally is that good operators will pay what is required to get the right independent assurance, whether it's mandated as a requirement upon them by their insurers or the banks or not. Many offshore companies, in fact any offshore company in this day and age, can ill afford the negative impact of something going wrong. A Transocean winner here washing up on the shores of Scotland doesn't look good for a global drilling contractor like Transocean. Those that remember the Kuluk, the Shell rig, the Arctic drilling rig that had a similar excursion onto the shores of Alaska a few years back, that set Shell's Arctic drilling campaign back at least 6 years. And it makes it harder for them to get back in with the regulator to get the necessary approvals to do what they want to do. This example here is a really interesting one. Maersk, globally respected brand. You know, these vessels tow things like this, support things like this, move things like that in the offshore environment. This happened in December 2015. It's worth pulling out the Danish Accident Investigation Branch's report on this, because for a worldwide sort of towage contractor, this was an example of appalling planning, appalling seamanship, and resulted in the loss of 2 ships, albeit being told to go to scrap. But the plan was never to scrap them in the bottom of the Bay of Biscay. They were meant to be scrapped in Turkey. And I think the mariners in the room would look at that and say, who approved that? That doesn't look right in descending the Bay of Biscay, but it got through. So how do the people who've got the main interest here, how do the key stakeholders exert influence on the process of reactivation? And there's a hard way and a soft way, which I'll sort of talk about now. For those that aren't aware, that is what's known as the room in Lloyd's of London, the underwriting floors, and the lutein bell is just on the other side of this little clock tower there. The Lloyd's Joint Rig Committee has tried to draft some definitions in terms of the layup condition of assets that help insurers underwrite the risk and therefore look at what they want to do when the assets are coming out of a layup condition in terms of the reactivation surveys. But as ever, there's no hard and fast rule with these things. And you can already see, well, we've got hot, we've got warm, we've got cold. Do we have lukewarm? We've got long term. It's not a binary thing. It's not a straightforward thing. And of course, what you also find is that, okay, the downturn started, or a particular company's contracts are coming to an end. Let's go into hot. But then it becomes a bit warm. Then it gets a bit colder. you know, what is the actual state of the asset now? Oops, what's happened there? Blanked it.
Got a.
There we go. Finger time on my part. So to try and break it down into something just slightly more understandable and binary, in broad order terms, what do we think about cold layup? Well, in the ideal world, it's got the higher preservation costs. It's about contractors deferring maintenance costs, reducing labour costs because they're on manned. But does it bring higher reactivation costs? Probably. Whereas warm or hot, you know, it's the opposite. The idea is you've got people still there. The asset is still inhabited. Machinery is still being run. But, you know, that doesn't tell the full story because, of course, not all of the machinery will be run, not all of the functionality of the kit on board is going to be tested. There's also the Lloyd's Joint Hull Committee, who drafted some words in 2009 on reactivation warranties that were meant to form the basis of this clause within the contract of insurance. And you can see what it says there. But one of the consequences of a soft insurance market is that it's a buyer's market. And therefore, insurance brokers, in terms of trying to get the best contractual terms at the cheapest price for their clients, are able to quite often negotiate a lot of these things away, which is a false economy. It doesn't really help anyone because all it's doing is removing that independent verification, that independent assurance to not just, you know, underwriters but also operators too, that says, yeah, your asset's fine, or not, as the case may be. I've already talked about the fact that many assets that are going to lay up now start in one condition but gradually drift through the sort of the temperature spectrum from hot to cold. And the good operators and the proactive ones, they're the ones who, you know, put the rig or the OSV to bed properly with proper engagement from class, proper engagement from independent surveyors as well. And I've done a series of rig layup surveys myself for assets in Europe before I moved out to Asia, where, yeah, you know, good practice was evident, the rigs were clean, the rigs were dehumidified, machinery was well preserved, etc., etc., etc. But not all drilling contractors and OSV operators are created equally. So this isn't always going to be the case. Everyone keeps harking back to the last downturn in the 80s, you know, how hard can it be? We've done it before, we've seen the issues before. Actually, no, not necessarily so. I mean, yes, there were issues in the 1980s, but not everyone suffered. There wasn't the high spec of assets there is now. There wasn't the sheer number of assets there is now, both in terms of rigs and OSVs. And the more agricultural rigs at the time, you could just stack somewhere, make sure they're sort of dehumidified and cleaned up, tank to empty, lock them up, walk away, come back when you needed them. It's not that straightforward anymore. And as the list here shows, there were some consequences that manifested themselves when they went back to work. And as I've already mentioned, we've got the 6th and 7th generation drill ships now being laid up for the first time. Many of them, like many of the very modern OSVs and rigs, are coming straight out of the builder's yard, straight into layup. So actually, that's not reactivation, that's activation. And the level of testing and commissioning that was undertaken prior to the layup occurring is really, really relevant to insurers who don't want to be using insurance policies as a means of paying for the final part of testing and commissioning of those new assets. We've also got a lot more electronic systems now as opposed to just electric systems on some of these assets. I think as was touched upon by someone earlier, merger and acquisition activity. The rise of bore drilling, for example, buying out, you know, worldwide fleets of modules from some of their competitors. but no one in bore drilling has ever activated or operated any of the assets they've now got. Again, as has been mentioned, many of the people who used to work on these assets are not going to be seen in the industry again. It's been lower for longer. They've found something else to do with their lives, whether it be lying on a beach in Thailand or building washing machines in the Midlands of the UK. I don't know. But they're potentially not coming back to do this sort of thing again, because why would they? The last time around, they got the fingers burned, they lost their job because the oil price tanked. And reduced and volatile asset values bring a certain pressure to bear on the process as well. So the sorts of things that the stakeholders are worried about. Generally speaking, they're looking at the 5 C's: condition, certification, compliance, crew, and conduct. And this is the sorts of high-level views that insurers or bankers will get from the experts that they've got in-house or that they contract out to ask the questions of. And in many respects, they don't know what they don't know, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, which is why they use third-party experts like us. And so what I would sort of say at the outset of this section is that the key to getting a reactivation survey right is knowing what the exam question is, getting the scope of work nailed down. Because unless you've got the exam question agreed between you and whoever's contracting you to do that survey, then you're not going to give the right answer at the end. So why do they want the survey? What do they want looking at? Agree the scope of work, and then you've got the basis to move forward. And this is where the eCMID templates and such like are absolutely valuable in guiding that sort of discussion and that thought process. So the sorts of things that concern people on condition: effective preservation, corrosion, degradation. We don't want wicking up electrical conduits or anything like that through humidity. Accommodation habitability, particularly out here in Asia. After a period of layout in humid conditions. Is there any hull damage? Not necessarily, hull damage that the asset had before it went in, but hull damage sustained during a period of layout, because many of these things are in fairly remote locations with stuff could bump into them and no one's any the wiser. And of course, unit security. Have bits been taken, robbed, or indeed just whipped off to go to a sister rig or a sister asset. What is the state of certification? Class, any interim certificates required, any flag state certificates. Is the SMS reactivated? Is the SMS valid for the asset? Particularly where it's changed owner and that sort of thing. And it is a condition of insurance that all of this sort of stuff is in place. And one of the examples I'll talk about tomorrow, the CTL of a rig was a no insurance claim because one of these bits was missing. Compliance, again, a very relevant point for insurers, but one for operators to consider here as well. An asset will be reactivating for something, to do something somewhere. Does it comply with the regulations for that somewhere? And a good example here would be FPSOs and drilling units operating in offshore Brazil, for example, many of which could be activated from this part of the world. They're required to comply with a fairly stringent set of rules and regulations that not all do. And they have been compliant under the previous contracts that they had in that area. They're going to a period of layout, it may even be brief. But coming back out again, they might need more work to get compliant with the latest regulations. Can they even comply? Is the asset able to comply with the regulations for where it's going? And of course, is the asset obsolete? Many regulatory bodies now, particularly for oil and gas exploration, expect some fairly stringent requirements of assets that if the asset comes out of the region to go back in, it can no longer comply with. So that's worth considering as well under the terms of reactivation and where it's going to, what's it going to do. Touched upon earlier, the crew, certified, trained, inducted, fit, experienced. This is probably going to be one of the most intangible and riskiest aspects of reactivation, because equipment, fixtures, fittings, certificates, they're there or they're not, they work or they don't, you know, that's fairly straightforward. But this, as was already said earlier, in the first instance, they might not be there to take a view on. And even if they are there, how do you sort of ensure this from a quayside in Batam or at the anchorage in Labuan or whatever? And it's just one of those areas that is going to be, you know, deeply subjective and probably liable to a lot of free text in a report. But it's that mariner's instinct, it's that experienced surveyor's instinct on this sort of thing. And of course, you know, the old sort of Venn diagram of risk, you know, you want everything to be in there and nothing to be sort of on the extremities. The other thing that's worth looking at as well, again, coming back to the point if the asset is being reactivated for a specific purpose, and perhaps this is now where we start to move from reactivation into a proper marine warranty survey scope for the activity as well, is the conduct of the asset out to its operational area. So let's take Moju as an example. You know, is the tool being planned correctly? Is there an adequate passage plan? Etc., etc., etc. And I've just put this in just some gratuitous video footage of waves at sea. But the point here is that, you know, this isn't secured and it's flapping about all over the place. But if you start, as the camera comes up, you'll see that the actual horizon doesn't indicate a sea state that you would normally associate with that sort of water on the deck. But the point is that Mojus in particular are very shallow draft assets that take water very, very easily. A lot of exposed vent trunking and other bits and pieces that can be found flooding quite quickly. So if the asset isn't being properly prepared for the tow, vent flaps are open, equipment's not secured, etc., etc., then the risks of multiplying, you know, manifold, even under the most benign of towage conditions. But we shouldn't get confused between challenges and risks. And we need to be clear as to what we should be worrying about, what's part and parcel of the normal process of operating complex assets in the marine environment, and what's a sort of genuine risk that we need to do something about. You know, does everything work? There's a difference between going onto an asset that's got, say, 3 diesel generators and one of them's down for want of a spare part that's on the way, than going onto something that's got 3 diesel generators where the top end of the engine looks like this. You know, one's a challenge, you know, get the part, get it fixed, get it running. One's a risk. You know, it's never going to work in a million years because no one supplies the parts you need anymore. A lot of the assets that will be activating or reactivating now are subject to high levels of automation. But does the kit that runs that, is it still supported? Who's qualified and competent to do the functional tests to make sure that, you know, the machinery control system is working correctly, that the winch control system's fine? You know, it's not a straightforward job to replace some of this because it's hardwired into the DNA of the asset. And of course, the final point there talks to, you know, a really, really hot topic in insurance circles at the moment, and that's cyber and the ability of assets now that rely on real-time shoreside satellite links for fault diagnosis, machinery monitoring, or whatever it may be. You know, how resilient are they to the cyber threat? Also, you know, many assets that went into layup could have had some long-term faults. We've all worked in an environment or had something even frankly at home, that squeaky kitchen cupboard door or whatever that we just live with. And it only becomes an issue if you rent the house out and the tenant says, I'm not happy with this. And it's the same with these assets here. if a crew's lived with something, it's not a showstopper, but they can work around it. That's one thing. But if it's a brand new crew who've never operated with this asset before, do they see this for what it is? Do they become fault blind and therefore risk blind as they reactivate this with more and more potential of these issues coming up? And of course, particularly where an asset has changed ownership, do we actually understand what the systems are telling us? Are they in the right language? Are they right to put that back into English, whatever it is it's telling us? That sort of thing, as trivial as it may sound, could become a bit of a showstopper for the asset that's going to sail in 2 days. On the upside, though, many of the assets in this part of the world in particular, and I think most people in this room will recognise that scene there, that are activating, not reactivating, hopefully because the shipyard struck a deal with the operator, these things have been preserved in pretty good condition, good security, so it should be a continuation of the activation process from build as opposed to a reactivation process that could be slightly more involved and slightly more painful. But that's not a given. Many assets may have started their layup life in the yard here, but may have then ultimately moved. And we as a company have done rig moves in the last few years where we have moved stacked rigs from location to cheaper location to even cheaper location, because laying an asset up isn't free. It's just minimizing the loss to the company. So, it's not always as straightforward as that. And as I've said, insurers aren't going to want to pay for what could be classed as routine shipyard testing and commissioning activity. So really, the warning for the operators is that, the immediate things that are going to jump up and bite you are probably going to be your mobilization and your tow to the field. And that's where some of the riskiest activity you can do, particularly with the mobile offshore drilling units. But there's a delayed hazard in here where, as things operate, things go wrong, things break, weather plays a hand, whatever it might be. Something that's got an inexperienced crew and is in poor condition is going to hide a whole multitude of pain for you somewhere in the future. So the opportunities for insurers and surveyors, hopefully you owners are going to be risk averse. They're going to want that fresh set of eyes on their asset as it's reactivated for the first time under their company banner. Drilling contractors have clearly got skin in the game for some of the reasons that I've hopefully outlined earlier. And the asset integrity could influence insurance premiums. A proactive operator that has done some form of reactivation activity, reactivation survey off their own back and presents that information to insurers will, in this market, will see a reduction in insurance premiums. So that sort of activity has a commercial impact alone, let alone all the other sort of benefits that you can get from that third-party independent insurance. And tows can be made safe, and they do need to be insured. Towing an asset in an uninsured manner means you are risking the entire value of that asset. Unless you've gone to your insurers, you've agreed what the MWS scope is, if any, for the tow, and it's been done properly. Owners, as I've said, worth looking at units now, particularly if you feel that the upturn in the market is coming, that you're starting to get a hint that some contract work could be coming your way. It's worth taking an early look and deciding at an early stage what to do and how to engage with the stakeholders in the process, insurers, financiers, getting the inspection company on board early to start that process. It is possible to look at crews and the safe systems of work, but you've got to do that at range. You can't do that, as Joe said, 3 days before the asset goes. It's too late. What you need to do is to be engaged early, and that's why I was talking to Alex about this earlier. As a company, we've tried to share some of the pain of the industry with our rates and stuff to keep our clients on board over the downturn. such that we've maintained that partnership, we've maintained those relationships, which make doing this bit of the process much easier, and it makes the reactivation, the mobilisation, the marine warranty survey aspects much less painful for the issuer as they start to get the contracts coming back in. Think about your asset value, and also, you know, how capable are the new operators? Have they got the people that came with the rig or not? Or basically, have they bought the rig to kill off the competitor, and then they're just going to scrap the rig? And as I've said, tows can be made much less hazardous, particularly through early engagement with whoever your towing contractor is going to be and whoever your marine warranty surveyor is going to be. So, to conclude, yeah, it's improving, but it's slow. And I don't think it's going to bounce back too quickly too soon. It's going to be more of a gradual improvement. Stakeholders, you know, the competing interests there are insurers who don't want, you know, any risk, or they want some because otherwise they get insurance premiums, but they want to minimise the risk of something happening, versus operators who don't want to pay for the facility. And it's worth pointing out that generally speaking, in offshore energy insurance policies, there is a 2.5% allowance for surveyors and technical experts' fees. 2.5% of the, that's 2.5% of the policy premium, which is great when the policy premiums are up here. 2.5% is more than adequate. The insured gets that as a discount on the premium, and therefore it's not too bad for them. But when premiums are down here, then 2.5% is not a lot, and insureds don't want to have to start shelling out from their own bottom line necessarily. I think that's pretty self-explanatory there. And the sort of final point here, really, templates and formats, yeah, they're one thing. As I've said, it's all about agreeing the scope of work with whoever's asking for this work, for the survey to be done. But it's also about that independent expertise that allows, you know, the experienced mariner, that seaman's eye, to look at something and say, well, it's all on a template, but it still doesn't look right. And, you know, we need to have a conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Questions? Any questions on what Simon said? We're quite an attentive audience.
Tomorrow's is much more interesting.
Simon, thank you very much indeed.